Hello and welcome to another episode of the System 2 podcast. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Sergio, who is the CEO at Aterio. And Aterio has been doing some really interesting work in terms of tracking data center development. We have a number of clients who are using that data, and so I'm very excited to have you on the podcast today, Sergio.
Thank you for having me, Mate.
So data centers, they're all the rage. How did you get started in terms of collecting data on what's happening with their development?
A little bit by accident, like most things in life. So we were making population forecast models. And when we were doing population forecast models, one of the things that you want to understand for people moving in or moving out of a specific location is events. New semiconductor manufacturing for fabs being generated because then that makes jobs, or RV bases that are closing down in one region and are popping up in another region. So we track events. And one of the events that we were tracking were data centers. And a large hedge fund came to us initially because they were looking for population forecast. And then they saw what we were doing with data centers. And they said, oh, we don't care about population forecast. We care about that. We care about tracking data centers and understanding the energy demand. So we began to do that a couple of years ago in partnership with them and understanding really well what, from a hedge fund point of view, what they were looking for. And that's how we began to actually track data center development and the energy demand of it.
How do you do that? How do you track data center development? What are some of the data sources that you're looking at?
So we do a couple of things, which is we want to track early signals. So the announcements first, and that comes from a utility filing. So when a utility is going to build not a data center, but a substation to power a data center, that's a really good early signal. So we track utility filings. We track building permits. So every time that AWS files a building permit in Texas to build a data center, we track that. And then we track company announcements. And then what we do is we use satellite images to track, do they actually build the thing or not? Are they actually beginning to level up the ground and begin to build up? And then we begin to track it on a monthly basis, how they build out the data center, the kind of equipment that they're using, how many buildings, stations next to them, gas powered turbines next to them to power them. And we put that on a data set that gets updated on a daily basis to our clients.
Curious how you figured all that out. If you're starting from tracking population to understand that you need a substation and you even what to look for in a satellite image to see what the progress is, how did you learn about the process of building a data center?
So it's again, it's working really well closely to the financial industry to understand what do they care about and what's their specific needs, and then being able to find subject matter experts and then being able to get them to understand and really do a deep dive in terms of the way that data centers work and the way that they power and then the kind of equipment that they use. It's just a learning curve, and it's a process where you hire really smart people, you put them in front of a problem which is shared by multiple buy-side firms in the industry, and then again we build up product that it's going to be useful for them.
There is a lot of backlash now around data center development. Are you tracking that? Do you think that's going to play a big role, or is that just more noise and it's not actually going to amount to any shutdowns of some of these data centers?
So we track that. We do a couple of things. One is we track meetings for councils in municipalities, because those are the ones who approve or deny a data center being able to get built. So we actually, or analysts go in and then look at recordings of those meetings, because those are public, and then they see what the community is saying about those. And then when we begin to see community pushback, and we're beginning to see more and more community pushback, we put that into the data set. So we put there's community pushback, and we actually lower the probability of a project. So if we see a project that it's getting announced and we begin to see organized community pushback, we lower the probability of that project from getting built from, let's say, high to medium, because we have seen Microsoft, we have seen Google withdraw projects because of community pushback. They go back, they withdraw, they take the community feedback that they got, and then they begin to submit it again. But we do see that those are affected. And right now, what is happening in Utah with the Stratus data center with Kevin O'Leary, that's a really good example of that is not only noise, it's beginning to show up in more organized activities against data center development, just because of the impacts that they have on prices for electricity for the community, the consumption of water, which is a big thing, and the generation of noise and employment. So yeah, we do track that. It's more noise right now, but it's beginning to become more an actual factor in terms of developments.
What is the story with the data center in Utah?
So Kevin O'Leary, which is this Canadian investor famous for Shark Tank, decided to build a couple of developments. One is in Alberta, and it's called Wonder Valley, and then one is in Utah, and that is called Stratos. The issue with Stratos is he's building it in Utah, which is a desert, and it's close to the Salt Lake, but Salt Lake is going down, it's losing a lot of water. And that specific data center is significantly bigger than most data centers in the US. So that's 9 gigawatts. And to give you an idea, 9 gigawatts is the equivalent to powering 9 million homes. It's a significantly big data center. So as you have something like that, it's going to drain a lot of water from the lake. It's going to generate a lot of heat because data centers generate a lot of heat. There's studies that say that is going to raise the temperature for the surrounding areas. And I think it's like 40,000 hectares. So it's significantly big in terms of the size of it. Again, because it's 9 gigawatts. Most data centers are 60 megawatts. So he's building a 9,000 megawatt data center in multiple buildings, while most of the data centers that you see are 100 megawatts, 60 megawatts, multiple buildings. So that's the story on that specific one. And because it's a new entry, so Amazon, Microsoft, Google, they've been doing this for 20 years. They have a lot of experience. They know how to build data centers. They're quite good at it. And then they understand how to engage with communities. They understand how to engage with utilities and what this process is, because again, they've been doing this for a while. This is one of those companies that is a newer entry, and it's building a massive data center. So that is going to get a lot more pushback and then a lot of more questions from the way that they build those things. You have the same thing with in Texas with Fermi America. They're building one for 11 gigawatts, and it's having, again, a significant amount of issues there. There's also one called Jules, that's 12 gigawatts. Again, there's a lot of bigger projects with companies that have never built a data center, and they're entering, and then they want to build the bigger data centers of them all. So that's where we begin to see more noise, pushback, and also volatility in terms of those developments versus hyperscalers. Hyperscalers, again, they have a ton of experience. They're really good at following up commitments and actually building those data centers.
Do you think how does that work? So you mentioned that given the pushback and the inexperience, see Kevin O'Leary is going to want to go ahead with this. So he's going to go back and adjust some of the plans and try to mitigate some of these concerns. Do you ultimately think this is going to end the project, or do you think it's just going to delay projects?
That I have no idea. I mean, it has already passed the council meeting, and that's the major hurdle that you have from a public point of view. As long as it passes, then he has the license to begin to build, and then he goes to the financial markets to get the funds to be able to build that data center, and then you have to deploy that capex into the actual construction, and that's where we begin to see delays and significant problems. So one hurdle is the community pushback, which he's getting, and then the approval from the municipality. He already got that. The next hurdles are actually going to be securing the necessary power, securing the necessary chips to be able to put into those data centers, and then be able to build them, and then be able to build them on time. And one of the issues that we see with newer companies that come in and build something for the first time is they don't have the experience, so usually those times run longer, they have more delays, and they have significant issues in the construction. It's like, if you think about it, Hilton has been building hotels for 40 years, and suddenly you have a company that comes in and says, we're going to build the biggest hotel in the world. We have never built a hotel in the world before. They're going to run into issues, and they're going to run into over budgets, versus Hilton or Marriott, where they have been doing this for 50 years. They know exactly what they want to do and how to do it.
And are you guys providing those timing estimates based on what you're seeing at various? I mean, so I understand conceptually that an inexperienced person is going to have a harder time doing this, but if we wanted to quantify that and say, okay, like how much longer is this going to take versus what they're saying, are you somehow forecasting based on the delays you've seen for that stage in the process to then, assume there's going to be further delays in other stages, or how do you think about the timing impact of this inexperience as it shows up in the data?
So yes, we do put timings and measure up the time that it takes for a data center to get built. And that is one of the major focus for our clients. So they want to understand exactly, is this data center getting built? When is that data center go from CapEx deployment into revenue? Because then that's a big marker for them to understand when a data center gets finally activated, because then that begins to generate revenue for the specific company. So what we do is, if the provider gives us a specific date for activation date, a target date, and we do get that a lot from especially neo clouds, the CoreWeaves and Cereros, and these newer entries, these new companies are going to say, for 2026, we're going to generate, for example, Joule, for 2026, we're going to have 466 giga on phase one. We go to a satellite image. We say, okay, you have two buildings. Those two buildings are those 466 gigawatts. We're right now in May. Right now, the stage of construction is at 30%. There's no way that you're going to get to 100% of that construction by Q4 2026. Most likely, it is going to go into either Q1 2027 or Q2 2027, based on what we see in the satellite image. You can actually begin to see patterns that repeat themselves. So when you see 1,000 data centers being built throughout the US, and you begin to see the way that those get built, you begin to see the way that they build out the shell, then they begin to put out the equipment, and then they bring the semi trucks to put in the chips and then deactivate the data center. And then we can get an understanding of the timelines that it takes from each one of those steps. And then we begin to say, okay, based on satellite images that we observe from this week or last week, we believe that they are at right now at 70% because they haven't begun to install backup power generators, or the substation is not ready. Therefore, we don't believe that this is going to be ready in Q3. This is going to be most likely a Q4 or a Q1. And then we're constantly revisiting those to give you an accurate representation of when is that data center going to be active, and then when is that company going to generate revenue as that data center becomes active. You went into mute. There you go.
So I was going to say, yeah, that matters quite a bit when it comes to the stock price of some of these companies, whether or not there's a delay on one of these data center builds. Are there, like, do you remember examples of where that's happened, where the market was expecting something to have been built and it actually is getting built earlier or later that impacts the stock price?
Yeah, so there was a really easy example, and you see this in the neo clouds specifically, but I'll give you an example. Back in January, we had AWS in the quarterly earnings calls, and Amazon in the quarterly earnings calls. What they did was they had this big project that they have, which is Project Rainier. They were deploying 1 million Trainium chips into that project, and we were seeing delays in that project. They have multiple phases. They have phase one, phase two, phase three. Phase one was ready. Phase two was supposed to be ready for December, but we were seeing delays in phase two. And phase three, they're just building phase three. So as we got into the quarterly earnings call for for Amazon, we knew that they had delays in that specific campus. And when they went into the earnings call, they gave guidance for higher capex. So they said, we're going to actually begin to spend $200 billion a year in data center developments, which was higher than what they previously gave the market. And our revenues right now for cloud, or cloud revenues for AWS right now, are not growing at the same speed. Because again, they did not have that specific project and a couple more ready. They had a really big backlog, but they were not able to put that backlog because they had a constraint in the capacity of data centers being active. And then the market saw that difference between a higher capex deployment, lower expected revenues, and then the stock market that specific stock went down about 10% that day throughout a couple of days. Then it went back, and then as they went into April quarterly earnings call, they said, "Oh, we're growing now at 40% year over year on revenues," something along those lines for cloud revenues. And then the stock began to perform completely different. So that's the kind of dynamic that you see. Neoclouds are super sensitive to this because that's their whole business. With Amazon, you have multiple lines of business. With Meta, with Google, you have multiple lines of business. But a company that just does data center development and then they generate cloud revenues like the again Cerebrius and CoreWeave and Crusoe, those are much more sensible to this.
Do you track data center development outside of the US?
Canada and the US. We're working right now to look into China and the UAE, so Middle East. The challenges with data centers is if you begin to, so we go really deep into the US and into Canada because we need to understand regulations. We need to understand utility companies, the utility companies that power those data centers and catch really early signals. So we have gotten quite a good experience in terms of understanding utility companies and how data centers get built in the US. If you go to Brazil, if you go to France, if you go to Germany, different languages, different regulations, just a couple of data centers per country. So the US market is about 60% of the overall data center built out for the entire world. So it's a significant presence versus many, many countries that have a couple of data centers, but have a lot of insight, a lot of details and nuances in the way that they get built. So we want to be able to build, to give really deep knowledge and really deep market intelligence into a specific market, which is the US, instead of going into multiple markets, but being more shallow in terms of the way that we understand those developments and the kind of information that we can give.
Besides data centers, what else are you tracking that is interesting to hedge funds?
Industrial developments and energy generation. And they go, and those come from conversations that we had with our clients. And then they say, okay, we're tracking data centers. And right now, for the last 20 years, we have built around 45 gigawatts. Enough power to build about 45 million homes. And right now, in the announcement, but have not begun construction, we have close to 300 gigawatts. So it took us 20 years to build 40. And now we have announced in the last couple of years that we're going to build about 300 gigawatts. That number doesn't make a lot of sense. It is a significantly high number. And the big question is, where is all that power going to come from to power those data centers? So chips, we can build chips. There might be delays, but we can get to that place. And you're beginning to see more companies building their own chips. So Amazon is building their own chips, Google is building their own chips, and you have NVIDIA and AMD and Intel. And then warehouses and land, that's easy to come by. The biggest challenge is going to be, where do you find the energy, the electricity, to power all of those data centers? Because building a substation, you take like 5 years to build a substation because you need the permits to build it, you need the environmental studies, and you need to build a transmission line. And then every time that you pass through a piece of land, then you need to justify how you're doing that. That takes a significant amount of time. So
What does a
understanding where
substation do in the process?
substations is just, you have a plant that generates power, a nuclear power plant or a gas power plant. You have transmission lines, and then you have a substation that gets that transmission line and then gives it to the data center. So you have a data center and then you have a little substation next to it. That's the one that is getting all of that electricity and then gives it to the data center.
And
So
is it
building
like,
transmission lines and substations takes a significant amount of time.
I'm just curious, like, is this widening the substation and not do the lines directly to the data center? Does it convert the electricity?
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. So to build a substation, you need 5 years. And yeah, that's not even taking into account how much time it takes to build a new plant to generate more. Well, do these power plants have capacity to increase the capacity by burning more fuel to create more electricity, or we need whole new power plants?
So that's the second part, which is, do we have enough in the grid to be able to power that increased capacity that is coming online? That's what our clients want to understand. Because right now there's been developments to build additional power electricity. And then you see companies like Constellation Energy signing deals with Microsoft for their nuclear power plants, and then 3 Mile Island being extended in terms of being reactivated. So you see a lot of new developments in the energy markets. The question is it enough? And what are the timelines when those energy developments come in? And do those timelines match the expected capacity from data centers that they want to go live? Because there's a significant amount of demand for compute that is not being met right now because there's not enough capacity. And so you have a lot of demand, but you don't have the supply of energy that is matching those dates. So that's why we're working on the energy generation side of the equation.
Interesting. And okay, so that makes sense. So the energy is related to the data center build, and these are second order effects that you need to track in order to figure out, okay, like we're building the data center, but we might not have enough power to actually turn the thing on, and that could be a bottleneck. But what else? What else are you seeing? You mentioned some industrials. What else are you looking at?
So the one that we spend the most amount of time right now, it's something called behind the meter. And behind the meter is you building your own power. You have an electricity markets, so power markets have been fairly stable for the last 20 years. I mean, population growth is 1 or 2% year over year. So you have markets that have been fairly stable throughout time. And then you build supply to be able to meet that demand from the users. So that's a fairly stable and sleepy market. Suddenly you begin to see AI data centers consuming a significant amount of power. That begins to drive your electricity demand significantly higher. So you have constraints in how fast you can build power generation plants, and also transmission lines, and also substations. There is a way to go around that constraint, to go around that 5-year or 7-year constraint of electricity transmission and electricity generation, which is instead of buying it from that nuclear power plant or that existing gas power plant that you have somewhere else via the grid, you actually buy the gas power turbines from Siemens or from GE Vernova. You put them next to your data center, literally inside the data center, and you don't get that to connect to the grid. So now you don't need the transmission lines and the substation next to it. You just build a power generation platform next to the data center and connect it directly. And we're beginning to see more and more of that. And that's called behind the meter, because you have the meter, front of the meter is the grid itself, behind the meter. So you have the meter is everything that happens in your facility, and then you build them yourself there. And that's where you see the market cap for GE Vernova and Siemens go up, and then you begin to see delays. So you begin to see that they have a backlog of 5 years of orders that they cannot fulfill. And that's where you see all of those companies that are not data center developers, but companies related to data centers, the ones that generate equipment. So Cummins, again, GE Vernova, Siemens, Caterpillar, all of those companies begin to generate significantly more revenues because of that demand. You actually see companies like Toto, the ones that manufacture bathrooms, also go up because they make a specific ceramic, and then that's being used by data centers. So the revenue suddenly goes up. So you begin to see all of these companies that have nothing to do with data centers. They make equipment for them, and then they begin to show up. And again, the way that you can go around that is by building your own power. We're beginning to see companies that repurpose jet plane engines, and they are repurposing that to generate electricity and then put it next to a data center, which is insane. If you have a constraint, you will do anything that you can to go around that constraint because you have a significant demand for compute from your customers. So you will pay an additional amount just to get a power generation unit while you wait the 5 years to get the grid. Grid is better. Grid is cheaper, is more reliable than if you put an engine from an old 737 next to it, and then you make something to be able to generate power. But in the meantime, you will take that because, again, you want to sell that compute.
How does the tracking process work in this case? I imagine there are less permits if you're just going to put in a jet engine next to your data center. How are you tracking the development there?
So you have, when you're burning fuels and then you're generating CO2, you have to file something which is a clean air energy permit. So clean air energy permits is, for example, Stargate, which is that big project from Oracle and Crusoe in Texas. They're building gas power turbines. They have already built gas power turbines. They bought them from Siemens. Those are significantly big because they need to generate electricity. Every time that they build one of those, they have to file a clean air energy permit to say this is the emissions that are going to come from this, and then these are the equipment that we are going to use. This is the brand that we're going to use from these units. Same thing for backup power generators. So backup power generators, those burn diesel. And then if you're going to burn diesel, then you're going to generate emissions. So that's where we begin to track how they begin to show up. And again, in the satellite images, we begin to see the gas power turbines. Those are fairly easy to see. We see Tesla battery packs in XAI data center. So XAI, they're building their data center. You begin to see next to it 180 Tesla battery packs, one next to the other, and how they install it. So you can actually begin to see that via satellite images. With the with the Oracle, we have a project which is Project Jupiter. They had some issues with the grid. So instead of going to the grid, they're working with a company called Bloom Energy, and then Bloom is generating microgrids for them to be able to connect. And then those things you can begin again to track up to a certain level via the satellite images, but then you see the early signals of that via the filings, the cleaner energy permits.
For the behind the meter power generation, how do they fuel that? How do you get, is it natural gas? I mean, I guess, nuclear, if you want to have like these micro nuclear reactors next to your data center, how's that work?
So mostly it's gas, and gas is cheap right now in Texas. And Texas has a lower regulation threshold. So actually that's where we see the most amount of projects. They go to Texas and they build them there because land, it's easy to come by. You have a lot of gas from the shale that it's actually very, very cheap. And then you just need a pipeline to be able to connect to that. Nuclear energy, so you have Oklo, you have TerraPower, you have a couple of companies that are developing those small nuclear reactors. We don't see those yet. We see that there's development, there's a lot of investment going into those companies. And then you see Bill Gates, which is Microsoft, investing in those developments. And then you also see Jeff Bezos, which is Amazon, also investing in nuclear energy, in small nuclear reactors. Now you see the relationship between Bill Gates investing in that, and then you have Microsoft needing a significant amount of power, and then suddenly that begins to make sense. But we don't see them being developed right now. Those are experimental. As we begin to see those small nuclear reactors being developed, then we'll begin to track them, and then we'll begin to track them via the data set, which I think it's super interesting, but that's going to take a little bit more time.
You mentioned batteries for XAI. Is that because they're using more renewable source? Like, is that the challenge? That's why you don't use solar or wind, because you need constant electricity demand for the data center?
So no, in the case of XAI, it's just because it gets them faster to what they want to do. So the case of XAI, it's a little bit of an outlier. Normally in a data center, AWS, they will go in, buy a piece of land, build out the buildings, then put all the chips in there, put the equipment. That's a normal development. What XAI does is they go and buy a plant that was already an existing plant. So they already have the shell. They begin to fill it up with chips as fast as they can. And then they go and put battery Tesla packs so they can get the power as fast as they can, while they build gas power turbines next to it while they wait for the connection to the grid. So it's like three different things. It's just that for them, they can go to market in 6 months versus 2 years that it takes for a normal data center development. And again, it's a way of thinking from a Silicon Valley point of view, which is let's make this really, really fast, even though it's not sustainable, but then we'll make it sustainable as we begin to put gas power turbines and then as we begin to connect it to the grid. So Tesla, again, it's an outlier, and that's why they use battery packs. Initially, we saw a couple of years ago that Meta and Microsoft were doing green commitments to power their data centers via renewable energies. So solar and wind, and they would sign something called a PPA, a power purchase agreement from those companies that would generate electricity. And they would say, you're generating 30 megawatts, we'll buy those 30 megawatts and we'll use those 30 megawatts to power data centers. That is no longer relevant because they need all the power that they can get as fast as they can get it. So it's not so much about sustainability. It's just, do you have power available? We'll buy that power from you, regardless of where it comes from. And turns out that even though the current administration is not friendly towards renewable energies, we do see that even if you begin to take subsidies out, or if you begin to put any kind of, if you begin to back up development of coal and other energies via not going into renewables still has a really nice demand from the amount of electricity being generated and being demanded. So you still see that solar and wind are having a really good advancement throughout the last couple of months, just because of that demand from energy that is happening.
Curious about people's career journeys. When you were a kid, did you think that you would ever have a company that provides data on data centers? Well, yeah. What did you want to do as a
What
kid?
about you?
How did you? I mean, that's the no. I definitely did not know this existed. But I'm curious about how what you were like as a child and the journey that got you to today.
So I like to build things, from being a child building Legos or building planes as a young child, and then getting into universities and building companies and setting up businesses. I like the fact of building something and then making it into a company and something interesting. And so that has always been there. What do I build? It has changed significantly from before, from my younger years to where we are right now. So again, data centers wasn't even in my mind a couple of years ago. I graduated from university. I worked in the financial markets. Then I built a couple of companies and I sold a couple of companies. Then I went to work for software as a service companies in the GRC space. So GRC is governance, risk, and compliance. So I worked for a couple of years in a SaaS company that did governance, risk, and compliance for large financial institutions and governments. And then working in one of those SaaS companies back in 2021, AWS was launching the data marketplace, and Snowflake was also launching their data marketplace. And if you think about SaaS, so SaaS as a system of record works really well. If you have a software system where you're putting all of your information, then that's one thing. But if you connect an outside feed to that system of record, and then that system of record is taking outside information and is beginning to talk back to you saying this is what is happening, suddenly that SaaS platform, that system of record, becomes something completely else, because then you have dynamic dashboards and you have workflows automated via outside events that are happening that are triggering actions within the company. And we saw that and we said, actually, more than software, being able to generate data feeds, and now that you're seeing different markets for data marketplaces, being able to generate a data feed, that's a super interesting place where I want to build and my career. So for the last 5 or 6 years, we've been working on data feeds themselves, and not on the software as a service part of things, but on the data provider side of part of the equation. Again, with a heavy focus on the financial sector, because those are the ones who are the first ones to use this kind of data, to explore it, to put it into their investment hypothesis, to test it out. And then you have a longer tail of industrial companies that want to use the same data, and research universe and central banks that want to use that data to be able to also make decisions. And then that's a different business. But that's where I come from. Again, I like to build things.
You mentioned you like to build planes as a child. I noticed on your LinkedIn you're a board member at the Pacific Flying Club. Are you also a pilot, or you still have an interest in airplanes?
Yes. So I have I a private pilot license.
Nice. What's going back to, it seems like a lot of the themes and what you're building, even on the data side now, it is you're tracking how other people are building things. So this passion for building things is still there. But I'm curious if you somehow were able to combine your passion for flying with data, would you Like, would you ever fly airplanes to take pictures of some of these data centers under construction instead of just relying on satellite imagery? Like, would you, if you could do, you combine these things, would you somehow?
That's an interesting concept. We actually are using drones to fly on top of data centers right now, and we're beginning to use that. There was this really interesting story from a guy that used to work at Jeffries. So he works in a venture capital fund right now. He used to work for Jeffries, and he said one of the craziest stories that we had in the bank back then, a few years ago, was a guy who bought a Cessna or rented a Cessna, would fly on top of oil tanks in Texas, and then would manually take notes of how high or how low the tops of those circle tanks were. And then he would put that into a data set that made it available. And then you can understand reserves. And the guy was literally flying a little plane on top of those. You can no longer do that up to that certain point, but you can use satellite images, which are easy. It's more scalable throughout the whole of the US on a daily basis. But we're beginning to use drones to be able to understand the developments, because then we can get closer. It's higher resolution. We're looking at thermal images to be able to understand if there's differences in signatures. So maybe not flying a plane, but tasking drones, and that's what we do. But if we can do something in terms of tracking any kind of data set that is relevant for satellites and because satellites are becoming a bigger thing, that would be something interesting in the future.
What mistake did you make in the first company that you started that you learned from and are now doing differently in your current company?
Ton of mistakes. We keep making a significant, a ton of mistakes, hopefully, because we make a little bit more good decisions than bad decisions, and then that takes us to be in a good place. Initially, I made a company with my friends, and I thought that my friends were also good business partners, and it was the same thing for all of us. So we thought that because we were going to be good friends, we were going to be able to work together and be able to build a company. That didn't work out.
What was the
I
company?
ended up losing my friend, and then we ended up going away from that company because we had different viewpoints on where the business was going to go. So it ended up amicably, but you may want to look for a friend that is a good friend and keep it like that, and then a good business partner which is aligned to what you're looking for from a company, and that's what we did later on in subsequent companies.
What were some of the qualities that made someone a good friend but a bad business partner? I'm curious about that because it would seem like, yeah, if you get along with somebody, but yeah, I totally understand you've never worked before, but yeah, I'm curious, like if there's some certain qualities that surprised you in them as a business partner that were not there as a friend.
So I think it's two things. One is the alignment in terms of where you want to go as a company and what your objectives are. So you may want to grow a company, and then the other person may want to just get as much money as they can and exit as fast as they can. And then you have a misalignment of outcomes. And that's one. The second one is the way that you think about who's making decisions, who should be the decision maker, and then the discipline of work. With friendship, you're just hanging out and then going out. But then in work, you have to be in the office at a specific time and then work and then be able to deliver the outcomes that you want. And that's a little bit different from, again, having a friendship and then going out whenever you like, to showing up every single day and then delivering the outcomes every single day. That's a little bit of a different thing.
Was the problem that you both wanted to make decisions, or was the problem that someone didn't want to work as hard and like didn't make enough decisions? Were you guys like too similar or too different?
No. So it was actually three friends, but we had three different ways of thinking about the business and three objectives. So at the end, everyone was working hard, but again, there was a misalignment of outcomes and objectives. And I think that's where this ended up being a lesson learned that I ended up using for additional businesses.
Do you have business partners today?
Yes, we do have investors. We do have about 8 investors in the company.
Nice. Well, what have you learned about team building? I'm also curious. I know you're originally from Colombia. You're now in Vancouver. Even culturally, they're different. What have you learned about building teams in Vancouver relative to relationships or how you made relationships in the past in Colombia.
So it's not so much from Colombia, but it's more from Canada versus the US, which is super interesting, and specifically Vancouver versus Silicon Valley. So I work for a company I've been here for about 15 years working in Canadian companies. There's a way that you do things, but then I work for a Silicon Valley company for a couple of years, and the way that they would go about decisions, the way that they would go about problems, and then solving those problems about hypotheses was completely different from what I was used to back in either Colombia or in Canada. And we began to apply that way of doing things from Silicon Valley here in Aterio. And that worked really well, which is we make hypotheses, we test those hypotheses really fast, and then we get feedback from those hypotheses. So we don't have projects that are successful or not successful. We never measure things like that. We just have a hypothesis. We prove that hypothesis if it's correct. If it's correct, then we double down on it. If it's not correct, then we learn something about it, and then we do an iteration, and we do it fairly fast. And that's the way that we actually build additional products. So we think that water quality is going to be something relevant for our clients. And we get a company like Clorox reaching out and saying, oh, this is super interesting, but we don't get a ton of interest. We know that that data set and that specific idea is not going to be successful versus we begin to put behind the meter, and then we begin to have clients saying, oh, this is super interesting, or data centers. So the way that we do things is more my learnings from building teams more, again, from the Silicon Valley mindset of fast iteration and fast hypothesis than from either Colombia or Vancouver.
I love that. You've seen a lot of data sets around the data center development, and many of the second, third order implications of this, whether it's the actual data center itself or the power or the energy that's going into to fuel this. If you were to in some part of this yourself, where would you invest? What do you think is interesting? If you can invest in anything, whether it's public or not, or whether you can just invest in some random, component in one of these data centers, where would you put your money?
Look at the biggest constraint as being the generation of energy, and that's sustainable throughout time because you will always need energy to be able to power these data centers. So there's a few companies that track data centers and they do a fantastic job, and you have companies that specialize on understanding the specific lot where that data center is and the facilities for that specific location, and they do a fantastic job of that. We don't go into that. There's companies that that do a great job in terms of understanding chips and the kind of chips that go into data centers and then tracking that supply chain, and they do a fantastic job of that. We don't go into that. We go into the hypothesis that we have, which is the biggest constraint for at least for the next 5 to 10 years is going to be the demand of energy for those data centers. And then we look at data center via the megawatts that they consume, and then the power generation projects that are going to supply that energy, and that difference between supply and demand. And again, we see that it may not go up as fast as possible in terms of a stock price doubling or tripling, like you see memory chips for data centers with SanDisk and all of these companies. But energy generation, I think, is going to be a significant constraint for the next few years. You'll begin to see mega deals like the one that we just saw with Nextra and Dominion 2 days ago. And we believe that the generation of energy is going to continue to be a significant topic, as you have humanoid robots, self-driving cars, data centers with AI, and then increased demand of AI compute. You need to power that. And that's where we focus most of our attention. And that's where I would think about having long-term investments that appreciate in time, but are also sustainable throughout time.
You mentioned that there are other companies that do a fantastic job tracking chips or the energy. Could you mention some of the names of these companies that you like?
Yeah. So semi-analysis, they do a fantastic job, and they're used by the financial sector. They have really good relationships with them, and they understand exactly what's happening with the supply chain. You have a company like Data Center Hawk. I think Data Center Hawk does a really good job in terms of understanding locations for data centers and where they're developing, and then leases and contracts. Again, a little bit of different use cases, but those are companies that I think they do a great job in tracking also this specific space.
I wonder if we can spend the last couple of minutes talking about the bear case for data centers. I was at an event last night where the main argument was that these leases are very long, where like the financing for some of these data centers can be 20, 30 years. And it is extremely, the point that the speaker made was that if you look back 25 years, top 10 companies on the technology side are no longer the top 10, or they've underperformed. I think the example is like they've underperformed the S&P. Only one of them has outperformed the S&P, which was Microsoft, and it only did that in the last whatever year. So for like 19 years, it underperformed. So the thought that these hyperscalers will still be the best companies 25 years from now historically has not been the case. And then that leaves you with, okay, you're building these, you're committing to certain expenses, whether it's on the power side or otherwise, and you may not have that demand 20 years from now, because who knows what the future is going to look like. I mean, I'm curious what your thoughts are on the downside case of these data centers, whether it's through these bottlenecks that you mentioned around the power side. Like, let's say we do end up building a ton of new power generation. What happens if the demands goes away? How can this whole thesis go wrong?
Yeah. Let's take the example of Meta, and we're beginning to see more and more of this. So Meta has a data center campus, which is called Hyperion, that's in Louisiana, but they're building it via a special purpose vehicle with Blue Owl, putting that off balance sheet, part of that development. So we're beginning to see companies like Microsoft, like Google, begin not to build their own facilities, but begin to lease out from other providers' facilities. We're beginning to see companies that pay a premium just to finance, not from their own cash flow, but from bonds or from using other companies. But then that gives them the facility for them to walk away from those longer term lease, of those 20-year leases. Because you're correct in terms of it's a really long lease, but the chips themselves, they have an active life of, let's say, 4 years, maybe 7 years, then they begin to degrade. So there's a lot of debate in terms of the chips that are being used and the depreciation for those chips. The longer sales, the longer leases that you have to commit in terms of power and the build out itself. But if you look at railways, if you look at the broadband connections via the dot-com bubble, if you look at oil via the days of standard energy and standard oil, you have those bubbles, and then you have cycles, and then you have companies that go bankrupt. But in the long term, the demand for broadband, the demand for cars, the demand for rails, the demand for oil has been continuously to climb up as we continue to develop as a society. I believe that the demand for energy will continue to climb up as we develop as a society, and then we have more use cases. The demand for compute will continue to climb up as we have robots, humanoid robots that are taking text, that are computing and using AI in video, in terms of taking video in, processing that, and then generating that. That's a completely different use case than you putting text on ChatGPT or getting Claude to do something. When you're getting video inputs into an AI that computes, that uses a far significantly higher amount of compute and resources. Again, autonomous vehicles and robots, you're going to begin to have that amount of compute significantly higher than what we currently have. Even if we become far more effective in terms of token generation and are able to generate chips that generate a significant more amount of compute with less power, those efficiencies will be constantly being overtaken by the amount of additional demand that society will have for a specific sector. So specific companies may go either under, may shift, or may underperform. But at the end, the specific industry itself, the amount of compute that society will use, I think is going to be increasing, the same as we continue to increase the amount of oil and electricity that we have been using for the last 100 years or so.
Well, Sergio, thank you so much for talking to me about this. It's a fascinating topic. A lot of our clients are very interested in tracking the developments here. And it's not just our clients. I think it's obviously impacting the broader world. So you're in a really cool position to continue to give us insights on what's happening. So thank you very much.
It was fantastic talking to you, Matej. Thank you very much.